The night began like any other on Jimmy Kimmel Live. Bright lights, a buzzing crowd, and that familiar hum of anticipation that fills the studio air just before a high-profile guest steps onto the stage. There was an extra charge in the room. Tonight, though, the audience wasn't just here for the usual light-hearted banter. They were here for Clint Eastwood, a living legend, a name that had transcended Hollywood itself. The applause erupted as Eastwood walked out, his iconic weathered face breaking into a small, measured smile. At 94, his frame wasn't what it used to be, but there was still that unmistakable aura, an unspoken gravity that commanded attention without needing to demand it. He sat down slowly, but not weakly. Every move seemed deliberate, as if time itself had learned to wait for him. Jimmy Kimmel greeted him warmly at first, offering the typical charm and a bit of flattery about Eastwood's enduring legacy. The usual small talk followed, a sprinkle of career reflections, a nod to Gran Torino, a joke about how Eastwood might outlive every Marvel superhero. The crowd laughed. Eastwood offered a faint smirk, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. But then Jimmy shifted. His tone sharpened, subtle at first, like the quiet crack of ice before it splinters. "Clint, you've been known for your strong views over the years," Jimmy said, his smile thinning, eyes gleaming with a hint of provocation. "You've stuck by some, pretty old-fashioned political stances. I mean, you're still hanging on to those Republican values in 2025. I gotta ask, at your age, is it really about conviction? Or are you just stuck in the past?" The room tensed. The crowd let out that awkward chuckle people give when they're not sure if something is meant to be funny. Eastwood didn't move. His expression didn't change. But the atmosphere had shifted, subtly, dangerously, like a still lake right before a storm breaks. Jimmy leaned in slightly, emboldened by the audience's reaction. "I mean, let's be honest here," he pressed on, voice tightening just enough to signal that this wasn't a joke anymore. "A lot of people think your views are outdated. Some even say prejudiced." A sharp inhale rippled through the audience. It was the kind of moment where everything stops. The space between seconds stretched thin. Kimmel was dancing on the edge now, pushing for that viral clip, that headline that would light up Twitter feeds by morning. Eastwood sat back in his chair. No anger flared behind his eyes, no flash of indignation. Just a slow, contemplative pause, long enough to make everyone in the room lean in just a little closer. But instead of firing back, Eastwood simply nodded, as if weighing something deeper than the accusation being thrown his way. His response wasn't immediate, and that silence was louder than anything he could have said in that moment. Jimmy, sensing the discomfort but mistaking it for weakness, leaned in even further. "Come on, Clint, you can't tell me at this point that you don't see how some of those old views, well, they just don't fit today's world. Maybe it's time to let go of the past?" That's when something subtle changed in Eastwood's eyes. A flicker. No, not of anger, but of something sharper, something colder. The look of a man who had stood through storms far more brutal than a late-night TV host's half-baked provocations. The crowd was quiet now, completely still. The tension was no longer fun. It was thick, suffocating. Jimmy shifted in his chair, perhaps realizing that the dynamic was no longer in his favor. But Eastwood didn't bite. Not yet. Instead, he just let the silence sit. And the silence was devastating. This wasn't going to be a cheap viral clip. This wasn't going to be a quick win for late-night television. The storm was just beginning to gather. For a moment, the studio hung in that unbearable silence, the kind that stretches so long it starts to feel like an accusation itself. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. No one shifted in their seats. No one dared to cough or breathe too loudly. The playful energy of a late-night comedy show had evaporated, replaced by something colder and more primal. Tension had sunk its claws into the room. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back, suddenly unsure of where the conversation was heading. His eyes searched Clint Eastwood's face for a reaction. Any reaction that might signal weakness, regret, or even irritation. But what he found instead was unsettling. Eastwood just sat there like stone. His presence was unshaken, as if every jab thrown at him had dissolved before impact. The silence broke, slowly, deliberately, with a measured exhale from Eastwood. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lean forward to meet Jimmy's challenge. Instead, he spoke with that same gravelly, deliberate cadence that had once echoed through spaghetti westerns and courtroom dramas. And even now, stripped of any character or script, it held the same authority. But before Clint could speak, Jimmy cut in again, nervous energy disguised as confidence. "Look," Jimmy said, forcing a chuckle that felt thin, stretched. "I'm just saying, it's a different world now. Times have changed. The things that might have worked in your era, well, they just don't fly anymore. You've got people looking up to you, Clint. Don't you think you owe it to them to, I don't know, evolve a little?" That was it. The match struck the powder, for the first time that evening Eastwood shifted, leaning forward just enough to close the space between them. His gaze sharpened, not with rage, but with something far more unsettling: disappointment. And in that moment, it didn't feel like Kimmel was confronting a frail old man. It felt like he was facing down the weight of nearly a century of hard-won experience. Years carved into every line on Eastwood's face, every pause in his voice. The kind of experience that didn't bow to trends or cheap applause. "You think this is about evolving?" Eastwood said, his voice low but cutting through the tension like a blade. "You think holding your ground means you're stuck in the past?" The air tightened like a noose. Every eye in the room was on them now, not in anticipation of a joke, but because something real was happening, something raw. Jimmy, sensing that control was slipping from his hands, tried to pivot, tried to reclaim the charm that had carried him through countless awkward interviews. "Hey, Clint, I'm just saying, nobody wants to see a hero of theirs stuck defending ideas that, well, honestly, sound outdated and, let's face it, kind of prejudiced in today's climate." There it was, the accusation, spoken plain and clear. For a second, the weight of those words hung between them like a hammer waiting to fall. But Eastwood didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in closer, close enough that the cameras had to adjust their focus just to capture the gravity in his eyes. Prejudice? The word rolled off his tongue slowly, like it was being weighed on an ancient scale. "You sit there, in your polished suit, on your safe stage, throwing labels like you're handing out candy on Halloween. But let me tell you something, Jimmy. When you've lived as long as I have, you learn that the world doesn't change as much as people like to pretend it does." The audience sat frozen, some visibly uncomfortable, others hypnotized by what was unfolding. "The world isn't black and white," Eastwood continued, voice steady, unshaken. "It's complicated. Values, real values. They don't shift just because the winds of popularity change direction. You want to call me outdated because I believe in responsibility? Because I believe in working for what you earn? Because I think freedom means something? You call that prejudice?" Jimmy opened his mouth to speak, but Eastwood didn't give him the chance. "I've seen more of this country than you can imagine," Eastwood said, his voice low but gaining momentum with every word. "I've watched politicians on both sides sell the same sweet lies to people desperate to believe them. You want to label me because I don't clap along with whatever the latest headline tells me to believe? That's not evolution, Jimmy. That's submission. And I don't submit." There was no applause, no laughter, just silence, the kind that settles into your bones and stays there. Jimmy shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing the narrative had slipped away from him entirely. He tried to recover, his voice stumbling just slightly. "Clint, that's not... come on, that's not what I was trying to say. I just think People expect more from public figures like you. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that some of those old beliefs, they just don't belong anymore." Eastwood leaned back again, his expression unreadable. The tension was suffocating now, real in a way late-night TV was never supposed to feel. And just when it seemed like Eastwood might let it drop, he delivered the blow. "I didn't come here to be your punching bag, Jimmy," Eastwood said quietly. "But if you think being a public figure means parroting what everyone wants to hear, then maybe you're the one who's stuck. Not me." That hit harder than any accusation could have. The room was dead silent. The cameras kept rolling, but Jimmy's composure was shattered. His trademark smirk had vanished, replaced by something rare, uncertainty. And in that moment, it wasn't Eastwood who looked outdated. It was Jimmy, sitting there under the harsh lights, exposed. This wasn't just an interview anymore. This was a reckoning, and the storm had landed squarely on Jimmy's stage. The air in the studio had turned thick, suffocating under the weight of something that wasn't supposed to happen here. This was late-night television, where awkward moments were glossed over with a joke, a wink, a commercial break. But this wasn't awkward. It was raw, and it was real. Jimmy Kimmel sat in his chair, the usual easy charm drained from his face, leaving behind something tight and uncomfortable. The smug grin he wore so effortlessly had all but vanished, replaced by an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and desperation. He had prodded the lion too many times, and now the lion had stood up. Clint Eastwood sat across from him like a monolith, unmoved by the weight of the room pressing down on everyone else. His presence was thunderous in its stillness. The silence that followed his last words wasn't just awkward, it was crushing. Jimmy shifted in his seat again, clearing his throat, attempting to reclaim something. Anything. "Look, Clint, this isn't personal. I just think there's a responsibility to acknowledge how things have changed. Society's evolved. Maybe it's time some of those older perspectives evolved too." It was a weak pivot, thinly veiled under the pretense of reason, but the audience could hear the fracture in his voice. Jimmy was trying to salvage the conversation, but every word dripped with the desperation of someone who knew the battle had already been lost. And then Eastwood moved. Not dramatically, not with some grand gesture. Just a simple, slow lean forward. His eyes locked onto Jimmy's with the force of a man who had spent decades facing down adversity. Not on a Hollywood set, but in life. There was no anger in those eyes. No venom. Just the quiet, overwhelming power of conviction. "You want to talk about evolution, Jimmy?" His voice was steady. Low. Final. "You think evolution means throwing out everything that doesn't fit the newest narrative? That every belief that isn't popular needs to be buried and forgotten?" The words hung heavy, sharp as glass. "I've seen this country change," Eastwood continued, voice like gravel wrapped in iron. "I've watched it evolve through war, through peace, through triumph and failure. And let me tell you something. Real evolution doesn't come from tearing down the past. It comes from understanding it, from standing on the shoulders of those hard lessons and carrying them forward. You don't get stronger by pretending history didn't happen." The tension in the room deepened like a crack in glass, spreading wider with every second. Jimmy blinked, clearly rattled, trying, and failing, to find a way back into control. "I believe in values that built this country. Discipline, accountability, freedom of thought. You think that makes me outdated?" Eastwood's voice didn't rise, but every word felt like it carried the weight of stone. "No, Jimmy. It makes me consistent. It means I'm not going to twist in the wind every time the world decides to call something offensive just because it's uncomfortable." The audience wasn't laughing now. They weren't shifting awkwardly in their seats. They were locked in, completely still, hanging on every word. The gravity of the moment was undeniable. "Here's the thing about responsibility," Eastwood said, leaning in closer now, his voice just a whisper above silence. It's not about doing what's easy. It's about standing your ground, even when it's unpopular, especially when it's unpopular. Because if you can't hold on to your principles when the world turns against you, then maybe they weren't principles to begin with. It wasn't just a defense, it was a dismantling, a masterclass in composure, delivered with the weight of lived experience. Jimmy sat frozen, the usual sharp comebacks dead on his tongue. Every attempt at humor or clever retort felt hollow now, small in the shadow of something so much bigger than the show, the audience, or even the platform itself. Eastwood didn't gloat. There was no smugness in his expression, just that same impenetrable calm. The kind of calm that didn't need to shout to be heard. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was powerful. The audience felt it. The crew felt it. Even Jimmy Kimmel felt it, sinking into the realization that this wasn't his moment to control anymore. Finally, Eastwood leaned back, settling into his chair with a quiet confidence. "You invited me here for a conversation, Jimmy, but it seems like you weren't really interested in listening." There it was, the final blow. Not a shout, not a threat, but something far more devastating. Truth delivered with undeniable clarity. For the first time in his career, Jimmy Kimmel looked genuinely lost. The crowd remained dead silent, the gravity of the moment sinking in like cold water. Every second stretched out like a reminder that Kimmel had underestimated the man sitting across from him. But Eastwood didn't push it further. He didn't need to. He sat back with the quiet assurance of someone who had faced down far bigger storms than this, and emerged stronger every time. The show limped toward its closing moments, but the damage was done. Kimmel stumbled through the ending, voice shaky, unable to mask the embarrassment bleeding through every word. The usual laughter track felt forced, the applause muted and uneasy. As Eastwood walked off the stage, slow, deliberate, unbothered, it was clear who had won this confrontation. Not with anger, not with theatrics, but with the simple, undeniable power of conviction. And the internet? It would explode overnight. Not with praise for Kimmel's bold questions, but with awe at how a 94-year-old Hollywood icon walked into a modern arena, faced down provocation, and left with his dignity and legacy not only intact but stronger than ever. In the end, the storm didn't belong to Jimmy Kimmel. It belonged to Clint Eastwood, and he weathered it like the legend he had always been.